The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit. The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Yeshitela Nai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study is based on a very important and internationally debated topic today, reparations to African people. Democratic Party U.S. presidential hopefuls are talking about it. The European Parliament is talking about it. African people are becoming increasingly aware of just how much has been stolen from us, and that's because of the work of our party. The study has been done. Our case for reparations has been made, and we have even initiated a process for which we obtain reparations to the Black Revolution right now. However, it's not the white ruling class who willfully decided to engage in this discussion. The question of reparations has been forced into the discussion by the intense struggles waged by our party in the African liberation movement. There will be several parts of today's study, starting with a 30-minute audio production of the first World Tribunal on Reparations conducted by our party in 1982, and a reading from the book Reparations Now, an abbreviated report from the International Tribunal on Reparations for Black people in the U.S., edited by Chairman Omali Yeshitela in 1983. You can access the study materials in the Facebook and YouTube descriptions, and I am deeply honored now to introduce my leadership, the one who has fought successfully to make reparations a household word and reality, the one who took it a step further to make reparations a revolutionary demand, the one who has helped to shape our understanding of what is owed to African people everywhere we have been dispersed, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru.
Uhuru Comrades, brothers and sisters, I want to welcome you to a continuation of this discussion on reparations. The reparations issue appears to many people to be something that suddenly exploded in the consciousness of people inside the country, sectors of the ruling class, the ruling parties of this country, and even sectors of the moneyed class in this country are discussing the question of reparations, some with great anxiety, and others assuming that the reparations are something that needs to be dealt with and discussed for reasons of their own. We'll talk about that. The thing that has most immediately brought reparations to the attention of so many people, most immediately, is the hearings, the judicial subcommittee hearings in the Congress dealing with the question of House Resolution 40. House Resolution 40 is something that was taken to the Congress by John Conyers out of Detroit, Michigan, 30 years ago. And up until June 19th, it has never even been able to get out of committee. And it's not out of committee yet, but there was a subcommittee hearing on June 19th that brought attention to a lot of people. And people saw movie actor and saw historian, writers, I should say, and other people who were discussing this question. And it excited a lot of people. And some people in the African People's Socialist Party, in our own movement, some people were perturbed by what they saw. And part of the reason they were perturbed is because they see some of the people who are dealing with the question of reparations as Johnny-come-lately opportunists or something to that effect. But I don't think that's an appropriate understanding or reading of what has occurred. What has occurred, of course, is a deepening crisis of this whole social system of imperialism. It is in disarray and disorder. It is flailing about doing everything it can to either maintain the loyalty of sectors of the masses in this country today, or to seduce sectors of the population in this country today. What is clear is that the crisis of imperialism has driven a huge sector, a meaningful and perhaps decisive sector at this moment of the white population into the open, naked embrace of a kind of white nationalism that usually it does not reveal itself openly within the respectable body politic of this country. Usually nice words and winks and nods and what have you are sufficient, have been sufficient to keep the majority of the white population locked into the embrace of imperialism. But with the deepening crisis, with more and more Africans and peoples around the world struggling to take back our resources, creating a smaller share of booty to be shared out and divided between sectors of the ruling class. We see this serious fracturing of the ruling class, not only within the United States, but internationally. The great immigration debate, which is made in part by growing numbers of oppressed peoples going to the colonial countries, the countries of colonizers who've been exploiting and taking their wealth and bringing them back to the centers of Europe, whether that's in England or whether that's in places like Amsterdam, Holland, and what have you, or whether right here in the United States, where the main target appears to be Mexicans. That's only because Africans from Haiti have fallen off of the radar immediately. So we see this deep and profound crisis and people fighting for our own interests, as I say, has challenged the solidarity of the tremendous amount of resources that have been, and the certainty of these resources going to capital at large, to the white ruling class at large. And so different sectors are splitting off, fighting to take their portion of what they feel should be their portion of the bounty, the booty that's coming in terms of stolen resources. So there's this huge crisis that has emerged. And within the United States, it's reflected in part by the success of Donald J. Trump, his candidacy that was nakedly attack on the Mexican people, where he's continuously fighting them even today, to the glee of a large sector of the white population in this country. And of course his divisive, we should say characterized as divisive, but it's clearly what makes it appear to be divisive because is that he's articulating a politic that speaks directly in an unvarnished fashion to the deep and profound white nationalism of a large sector of the American politic. And he seems to have locked much of that up. On the one hand, and he is coming from that sector of the bourgeoisie that is organized through the Republican Party. the other party of the bourgeoisie, the Democratic Party, in fighting for control of the state, which is what elections are all about, nonviolent contests between different sectors of the ruling class of who will control the state. You see that the Democratic Party is much more fractured than the Republican Party. Most of the base of the Republican Party and most of the bourgeoisie associated with the Republican Party at this time have decided that Trump represents their best interests, although the bourgeoisie sectors of it have simply gone over to the Democratic Party, and as usual, some hedge their bets, putting money in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party because with no particular interest in who wins the election, as long as their interests in terms of what party, as long as their interests are protected and advanced. And Trump obviously frightened many of the who are part of the bourgeoisie, who are part of what we might call the Atlanticist camp, who have controlled the policy of this country for the last 70 years or so, since the end of the Second Imperialist War, the creation of NATO, the creation of the United Nations, the creation of these other entities and institutions through which the whole world has been governed under the brutal dictatorship of international white power. So when Trump became elected in part as a campaign against the United Nations, against NATO, against the trade relationships and deals that had come about subsequent to the Second Imperialist World War, he shook up that foundation because a lot of interests were tied directly to that trajectory had been established 70 years ago. But he shook it up and was able to shake it up because the foundation upon which it rested, which is the exploitation, the successful, ruthless, brutal, bloody exploitation of the peoples of the world, stealing resources, now does not come as easily. And that's why you see these unending wars that the United States government is involved in, 25 years, almost, or 20 more years in Afghanistan alone, Iraq. Now they have to go into Venezuela, they're attacking Yemen. They're all over the place trying to maintain this parasitic, blood-sucking relationship that it has with the colonial peoples. And so Trump has taken the gloves off. This sector of the bourgeoisie that now surrounds Trump has taken the gloves off. On the other hand, you have another sector of the bourgeoisie that wants to make a contest with Trump that fights from within what they call the Democratic Party. And this is a force that has trying to organize as many sectors that's been left out, that's pushed aside, obviously by that sector connected to Trump. And that means black people, that means homosexuals, that means women, that means Latinos, that means all these other people they are trying to pull and corral into this place so that they can fight to control the state apparatus that Trump now controls, which includes the CIA, FBI, military, the court system, the jail system, everything that they need in order to carry out the will of that sector of the bourgeoisie. But you can see how split the ruling class is because you got 25 or more candidates vying for control of the Democratic, to win the Democratic nomination. And each of these is someone that is supported by a sector of the ruling class. So they fund them, they put them out because they see these forces as representing their particular interests. That's what we see happening. And now what is necessary is for this sector of the bourgeoisie to contend with this white nationalist flank that is in the Republican Party now, that controls the state apparatus now, even though it's shaky. That's why Trump is making war all the time with the FBI, the CIA, and various other entities that represent the state apparatus. Now you see 25 or so members of the Democratic Party fighting and contending with each other in order to capture control of the state, and they have to win Africans and other people. And so even before now, we saw this movement to unite, consolidate the body politic in this country, first of all, against all the peoples around the world who are fighting to take their interests back, to create a certain kind of American patriotism, to destroy to bring about, to unify white women with the bourgeoisie, so that now white women can be in the military and can be in the police and do the horrible things that only white men were given the privilege to do earlier on. That gay people can be a part of the military. Why the hell not? Bring gay people. We need, everybody with a gun who will defend imperialism and keep this sector of the white population from fighting against the social system. Unite them by granting their ability to kill and be a part of the killing machine, just like white people can do. So this is part of what's happening, and Obama, of course, played a similar role when it came to Africans, to make Africans loyal to imperialism. We have been the most serious contender with imperialism and capitalism, colonialism, and the aggression that's made against Africa and other peoples around the world. The most serious contention was centered in the African population. Obama was playing that role to try to pacify and neutralize African people as a political force. And now, and Obama was able to do it as an African, and then as an African, he was able to do it and hold on to a sector of the white population by coming out against reparations. But now you got these white candidates and others now having to be for reparations because the plight of the African and other people has become so great, and the work to push the reparations issue has been consistent now for more than 40 years or so, and it is one of the critical questions that the body politic has to contend with at this time. So our party began seriously involved in the reparations debate in 1976. In 1976, we participated in organizing for a mobilization in Philadelphia that was to be the bicentennial, the 1976 was to be the bicentennial year, the year that the U.S. government was doing everything it could to pump white nationalist patriotism in the country. Even fire hydrants around the country and curbstones were painted red, white, and blue. And a liberal sector of the left in this country combined with the Puerto Rican Socialist Party to organize what was called a bicentennial without colonies. And that occurred in 1976. And we participated in this fighting for bicentennial without colonies, even though that is absolutely hard to even understand how you can have a bicentennial, centennial, or day of Americanism without colonies. We participated because they raised the colonial question, and the colonial question had been erased from the discussion in this country with the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s. So 1972 gave us an opportunity to be before these masses of people and to reintroduce the question of colonialism back into the debate, into the discussion. And during this process, we were able also to push the question of reparations. So we've been pushing actively the issue of reparations since 1976. 1980 became decisive in many ways for us because we participated in one of the kinds of the discussions that were going on around reparations in New York City, and we made a determination at that time that we would take this demand for reparations from this politic where people simply ran around with their briefcases and tried to get different legislators or legislators to sign on to reparations as the primary process, or they would try to get some kind of court to unite with the principles of the question of reparations. We said that that's not enough, that if reparations is to be a reality, then it has to be something that the masses of African people embrace. At the juncture where the masses of African people embrace the question of reparations, then that's the time where you can guarantee reparations. That's what's going to determine what the court does. That's what's going to determine what the legislators do, etc. Masses have to grapple with this question. And not only that, but masses have to grapple with this question under the leadership of a revolutionary party. Because the serious deficit that we were confronted with at the time is that the revolutionary organizations had been destroyed for the most part. And the African People's Socialist Party was the only revolutionary organization that was committed to completing the Black Revolution of the 1960s. And so in 1981, at our first Congress, some 9 years after our after our founding, we put on as a resolution from that Congress the one that pushed for reparations, to make reparations a critical component of our work. And so we've been doing that, 1981, 1982, to carry out our mandate to make reparations a household word. We began with this World Tribunal on Reparations for African People in the United States, and held a World Tribunal in New York City in November 1982. And that's part of the process that we were using to make reparations, take it beyond the small group of people who would simply meet and discuss reparations, say, yes, we want reparations, and convince ourselves over and over again the value of reparations, and then take it out into the world. And to put the demand for reparations, to make it a property of the masses of African people, to introduce it. And we said that at that time, we didn't care if the NAACP or the SCLC or the Nation of Islam or any of these other organizations want everybody to unite around reparations. And we didn't care if it went to the Congress, and we didn't care if people went to court, but we knew the power was in the people. And from our perspective, from the perspective of the African People's Socialist Party, that was central to the demand for reparations. And our analysis is one that helped us to understand that the whole rotten imperialist edifice, every penny, every dollar, every dream of the white population was based on this ability to continue to exploit resources from African people in the United States and around the world. And so we did the tribunal. And what's significant in part about that is H.R. 40, that is the Conyers bill, the bill that brought people to the U.S. Congress on June 19th to talk about reparations, was a bill to get a study, to do a study of whether reparations was necessary. And what we're saying is that, first of all, the U.S. Congress is not about to give reparations. It's impossible for it to give reparations. It might be pushed into a situation where it will give a payoff to a sector of the African population and call it reparations with the support of that sector of the African population who will settle for whatever the Congress provides them. But we've understood in the African People's Socialist Party that reparations is a function of the revolution, that African people are colonized in this country, and the United States Congress is a part of the United States government that's responsible for maintaining the oppression and colonization of African people. Therefore, what the tribunal did was not go to the Congress, but to put the Congress and the United States itself on trial. That's what the tribunal was all about, to put the Congress on trial, to put the United States government on trial, and to maintain the power of the people. Now, we've seen since then, everybody's interested in reparations. We say, right on, that's what we were pushing for. But we see reparations is something that's going to be achieved when masses of African people, under the leadership of the advanced detachment, under the leadership of its revolutionary vanguard, begin to seize what belongs to us. Ultimately, that's what it's going to take. And I know that we'll be able to push different sectors and sometimes different components of the state organization to make certain kinds of concessions around reparations. That's already in the works. The fact that they have to discuss the question at this point means that they've opened the door. And they open the door for people to say, this is, you owe us this, you owe us this. And now it's become a part of the public discourse in a really important way, so that Africans who are being pursued and hunted like animals in every oppressed colony in the African community will understand that will now assume the ability and the need to become the hunter as opposed to the hunted, to take back what belongs to us, and we'll feel justified in doing what's necessary to repossess what has been taken from us. I saw just the other day a very brilliant person wrote an article saying that we're already late to the great black reparations debate. That's what the title of the article was. And when he says we, he's speaking from a class position. Every class speaks of the population, the masses, from their own perspective, from their own position as a class. And that's because the reason we are having this discussion today, in part, is because the African petty bourgeoisie has been incapable of recognizing the leadership of the African working class, even the African working class as it presents itself through its advanced attachment, the African People's Socialist Party. It's really interesting because many of the people who are now for reparations claim, many untruthfully, that they were members of the Black Panther Party in the old days, because there's no Black Panther Party now to contest that. And because the Black Panther Party is the last good memory that people can have and say, we were bad back then, but you don't have to be bad today, right? And but the truth of the matter is that one of the things that made the Black Panther Party an important feature in the history of our struggle is that the Black Panther Party was an organization that was founded for the purpose of taking power, pursuing and taking and wielding political power. But none of them is. We are. Our objective is to take power. Our objective is to not only to take power, but to take power in the interest of the African working class, the pants-sagging African working class, the funny-talking African working class. That's the ones who are pursued and hunted and slandered every day. That's who we represent, and we don't apologize for that. We don't speak good English. We don't act proper in most circumstances, but we are the class, and that's where the power is located, and that's who we represent. And that's why they haven't been able to recognize us, even back during the day when they claimed they wanted reparations, many of them. And it was, we formed an organization in 1982. Immediately following the World Tribunal, we organized the African National Reparations Organization, which initially was supposed to be an organization of the leading anti-colonial forces in this country, all of whom at that time proclaimed a belief in reparations. But none of them would participate in forming that with us as a part of a joint effort that the whole African National Liberation Movement would be able to control. None of them would. It was because of the leadership of the African working class in the form of the African People's Socialist Party. And the only time they jumped on board was in 1989, 7 years after we were founded, and that was when Ronald Wilson Reagan, one of the most reactionary presidents of the United States, if you can characterize them, if you can grade them, before Trump. And he gave a pittance that it was called reparations to the Japanese who had been locked up in concentration camps by the United States government during the Second Imperialist World War. And their property taken and what have you. And so Reagan gave them reparations. But the fact is what he called reparations. Then the people who we've been trying to work to become a part of the African National Reparations became instant believers, and they all came together not to join with the African National Reparations Organization, but to create a new organization for reparations. And the one who was most responsible for that has been characterized as the father of the reparations movement, and this was something 7 years after. 7 years after this incredible tribunal that we had in Brooklyn, New York, and then 7 years after the tribunals that we were having every year in different places throughout the United States to bring this issue to masses of people who could come together and testify about their conditions that show why reparations was necessary. 7 years later, this person calls together this group and is characterized as the father of the reparations movement because of that. Because there's an absolute refusal to recognize the significance of the working class. And the African People's Socialist Party, the working class, has no faith in the ability of the United States government to serve our interests and recognize that if we are to have anything, it's going to have to be because the African working class, leading its own organization, fighting in the interest of the entire African nation, seizes what belongs to us. And so that's what took us to that's what had to do with our approach to the question of reparations. So from the very beginning, take it to the people. From the very beginning, one of the persons who, when we said we were going to do the reparations, the man came up with a kind of ADOS position, was upset because we had a body of jurors who would be listening to testimony where we would charge the United States government in demanding reparations, but on there were African-born Africans, as I say, Africans who were born in Africa, from South Africa, from Senegal, and I think perhaps from Congo. And so this great leader who came to be the father of the reparations movement declared that he was opposed to this tribunal in part because the Africans who were judging to determine whether we should get reparations were born in Africa, and the Africans in Africa owe us reparations too. Like somehow we were some separate entity, and as we hear coming from this ADOS nonsense, and so that was one reason for opposition. That was 7 years before they pulled together this thing to hope that Reagan would give them reparations, and they said explicitly, because you might want to get your teeth fixed, you might need a new car or something to that effect, and therefore you have to get reparations. Went to the lowest possible denominator to win African people to reparations with that kind of nonsense. And of course, another reason that they said they were opposed to reparations is because the party had created the African People Solidarity Committee, an organization of white people who works under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, under the leadership of the anti-colonial struggle for African people. And they said because the white people are going to get all the money anyway. This is a common refrain that we heard all along. So we get reparations through what you're doing, the white people are going to get the money, and then the Africans on the continent of Africa owe us money too, and this is the kind of nonsense we were confronted with. But we moved the reparations thing forward. And of course, part of what our task was, we used international law, as we will discuss here. It's not because of any confidence in international law. Most of the law that was created even internationally was created where Africans were not at the table. The law is simply the opinion of the ruling class. That holds true internationally. But what had happened in the 1960s with the revolutions that began to unfold, then more Africans involved in anti-colonial struggles went into the United Nations, but didn't just go into the United Nations. They were newly liberated from control by England, by France, by other countries and things like that. And so they took into that a different kind of dynamic, even though they were most often the petty bourgeoisie, but they were anti-colonial. And so that helped to shape some of the law that came into the United Nations at that time. And it gave, they had some political momentum growing from the anti-colonial struggles that were happening from the places that they came from. It didn't take too long, of course, before the United States government had crushed most of that. They had already killed Lumumba. They overthrew Nkrumah in 1966. They killed Che in 1967. So they were cleaning house. They were destroying much of what could be a contention in the United Nations, even though the United Nations is rigged by structure and law to support and carry out the wishes of the international imperialist interests. So that's what we were looking at. But we say we went to the United Nations, used international law at this time, because part of the objective was to isolate the United States, in the world, to create opposition to the United States throughout the international world, and to use even international law as a political vehicle through which we can enhance the isolation of the United States. Now that was headed by Ronald Wilson Reagan, who was the Donald Trump of his era. That was how we were moving. It was not some simple thing that suddenly, the white people are going to give us all the money, because they ain't going to give us nothing. We're going to have to take everything we get, but it's ours, and it should be ours, and it should be something that's won to the consciousness of African people. And at the point that happens, then we will get it. And that's why what was important to us on June 19th and at Congress was important, not because the Congress is going to give it to us, because so many Africans were able to see it and hear it, and that's why we're having this discussion today. So that's sort of an introduction in what we're going to be doing. And so we did this in November. The Reparations Tribunal, World Tribunal Against Reparation, happened in November 1982. In 1983, we produced this book, Reparations Now. And so we're going to read from this book, but before we're going to supplement this reading. We've done this last week, and we'll do it one more time next week. But to supplement this reading, what we want to do is play for you a 30-minute radio production that was produced in 1982. The same year we produced this radio production so that people could get a sense of what happened to the tribunal, to take it out even beyond where we had taken it up to now. Since that time, as you know, we do get reparations from the same white people that they were concerned with going to get all the money. We do actively achieve reparations. We have built an international organization of African people around the world from the same Africans who sold us into slavery according to the logic of some of these backwards forces, and they are backwards, and there's no other word. There are other words for it, but we'll be nice and just say backwards forces. And we have had effective reparations, popular reparations campaign. We have institutions in places around this country where literally thousands of people, if there's a discussion around reparations today, it has to do with all the work we've done. We travel the world. I was in Ireland. I was throughout Europe. I was in African communities around the world, winning people to the reparations position since 1983. And we have created institutions, economic institutions that white people, among others, participate in because they know that it is a part of the reparations demand, and we've used these institutions to generate capital that we've been able to put in economic institutions that's run by African people, so that it's not to get your teeth fixed or anything like that, but it does create a Black Power blueprint in St. Louis that's transforming the entire African community there. It does create the ability to get a couple of radio stations and to have other kinds of economic institutions. Thousands of people go through these institutions. Thousands of these people every day, certainly every week, go to our furniture stores and emblazon on the banners and everything in the furniture stores is reparations. This is an economic institution going to Black economic development and reparations. Thousands of people go to our flea market in New York, where there are more than 100 vendors who participate in and feed their families through that, and they recognize that it's a part of a reparations institutions that they are contributing to. And so we've been doing reparations work, and this is part of what makes it easier for people to even have the discussion of reparations, because we've been doing this work not just in the African community, not just in small circles of us talking about reparation, but a broader sector of the African population and the white population too. We engaged and we had a political campaign, an electoral campaign just 2 years ago in St. Petersburg, Florida, where a white candidate under our leadership running for mayor in a city that's only 23% African ran a campaign under the slogan, Unity Through Reparations. And hundreds of people were involved in that. Hundreds of people engaged, were marching down the streets. White people going Unity Through Reparations. We engaged in the political campaign even as we have this discussion demanding reparations. So masses of people are involved in this and the Congress is not. And the thing is that this is not just some abstract discussion around reparation that we're involved in. We say we want reparations because you stole this from us and now you're turning into institutions against it. We want it back. Not only do we want it back as part of reparation, but we want an infusion of capital that should have been ours if we had had it. We want the government to present that capital to us, and we want white people to join with this demand for reparations because they take my money, your taxpayers' money, and they've done these other things with it. We want it back. That's what we're doing concretely. It's put it in the question in the possession of the masses of the people, and that's what's going to make the difference, and that's what I want us to listen to. So we're going to go ahead, and you will hear the testimony from different people who participated. This is snippets of the testimony. And this, by the way, Reparations Now, we plan to republish this, including much more testimony that did not make this condensed version. We will include that in the next one. So this issue from HR 40 to do a study of whether reparations due to us, if anything is late, 40 years late at least, is this question. We've done the study already. That study was part of the Reparations Tribunal, and you could hear the witnesses, and they were not movie stars, and they were not simply people who wrote stuff, but people who were actually engaged in struggle, many of them, and people who were speaking to the people as opposed to speaking to the Congress. So let's go and move with the clip that we're going to play from the Reparations Tribunal in 1982. Uhuru.
On November 13th and 14th of 1982, the African National Reparations Organization, a mass organization of the African People's Socialist Party, organized and conducted a World Tribunal on reparations for black people. Addressing the question debated across the U.S. today, are African people owed reparations? Listen to the testimonies from this tribunal and you decide.
Today, we are initiating a 2-day trial of the United States government for crimes it has committed against the black or African population of the United States. Today we are initiating a 2-day process which is remarkable and historic in its implication for the use of international law as a means of addressing the crimes against oppressed people who do not have the benefit of state power and the use of national and international courts, which are traditionally only available to those groups who do possess state power. To withhold the right to justice and international legality to the powerless, oppressed African people in the United States would be to validate the most cynical concept that might makes right. It would give credence and validity to the awful concept of the right of the powerful to make and enforce international law. Such law as that is no law at all. It is accepted tyranny. Therefore, this World Tribunal must determine whether international morality might prevail in the interest of the powerless. This tribunal will determine whether, even in the absence of state power, the rights of the oppressed will be recognized as rights which may be respected in the form of applied international law.
On November 13th and 14th of 1982, black people from around the United States and the world came together at an international tribunal in New York to hear evidence, historical, statistical, and personal, on the right of black people in the U.S. to receive reparations from the U.S. government. Before an international panel of judges and observers representing popular movements in the Congo, Senegal, Barbados, the United States, and Tanzania, 14 hours of documentation and testimony was presented to support the charge that African people experienced genocide. This was not a mock trial. International law was laid out and legal procedures followed. This international law consisted of charters and treaties passed by the United Nations after World War II to hold governments accountable to the world community. The judges heard the charges, followed the evidence, cross-examined witnesses, and rendered a verdict. Testimony was put forth under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which has been ratified by a majority in the United Nations, but which the United States Senate has refused to ratify for fear of being charged before world courts concerning the cases of Native American and African people in the U.S.
The Genocide Convention declares as punishable crimes any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
The first testimony came from Dr. Leonard Jeffries, chairman of the Black Studies Department of the City College of New York, who detailed the birth of civilization in Africa and the subsequent impact of the raiding slave merchants.
For 40 or 50 years, the Portuguese had been touching the coast of Africa, and they knew the riches of the culture and civilizations that had been developed there. The civilizations of Ife and Benin that produced the art, which is as classical as any art ever produced. The civilization that produced the city-states of Nigeria and the city-states of other parts of Africa. These Portuguese, being land poor, resource poor, and people poor, had to have their mind blown when they got to the Gold Coast. So the Portuguese in 1482 came back to Africa and established a permanent base, which became the beginning of the process of genocide that saw 100 million Africans destroyed. That permanent base was called Elmina of St. George. And after that period, hundreds of slave forts were built along the African coast. In Ghana alone, along a 200-mile stretch, there are the remnants today of 50 slave forts and castles, some of them only a few miles from each other, as the European blood sucked the African continent. In that 50-year turning point of history, when Europe moved from the periphery of world history, from its dark ages, onto center stage, and moved out African and Southern Asian and Indian peoples, the roots of that which we have to deal with today in terms of the condition of our people are there. They come out of the slave trade system, which, as Walter Rodney says, went to the development of Europe and the underdevelopment of Africans. In this 50-year period of history, you have the basis of genocide, the basis of religious intolerance, the basis of fascism. But I don't want to leave us historically with a negative note. The last period of history is 1900 to the present. 1900 to the present is the period of the African Renaissance. 1900 to the present is the period of the African Revolution. And Garvey and others understood this. The revolutions in Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau, the revolutions taking place around Tanzania and Namibia, the movements in the Caribbean around Grenada, etc., the Cuban Revolution, the struggles of peoples on the streets of Harlem and Bedford-Stuy. These are all part of the renaissance and rebirth of African peoples. And although a genocidal process existed in history, we are reversing that genocidal process by moving into an African revolutionary consciousness.
In addition, a historical brief was submitted with documentation of extensive economic research on the amount of wealth stolen from the labor of African people held as slaves in the U.S. Wealth which was the basis of the U.S. economy for its first 100 years and which gave birth to the capitalist economic system. Estimates of wealth stolen from African people's labor through the special structures of tenant farming, wage discrimination, and the dual labor market were also made for the years following the abolition of formal chattel slavery. A minimum estimate of the wealth stolen from black people for labor alone, leaving out charges for damages incurred through murder, maiming, and rape, amounted to $4.1 trillion. Joe Mashariki, chairman of the Black Veterans for Social Justice, brought out detailed information on the use of black troops to enforce U.S. power around the world, at the same time that black people are suffering under the rule of that state power in the U.S.
The United States government is guilty of mass genocide and degradation against Africans here in America. The economic wealth and development of this country was built on the backs of black slave labor. All persons who enjoy the fruits of the so-called democracy today enjoy it at the expense of black blood, sweat, tears, and lives. As an organization of veterans from World War II to Vietnam War who fought in these wars, our motto is blacks fight no one else's war no more. We have adopted this motto because of our experience in this country. However, this motto doesn't exclude us from fighting our own war. I want to be clear on that. Such as in Tanzania, Namibia, Mississippi, or New York. People who know the anti-war movement know that the type of internal chaos that took place in the military, which helped to stop the war, and that came from people right here in our communities. The whole white anti-war movement couldn't get off the ground until blacks refused More blacks refused to go into the military during the Vietnam War than whites, 8-2.
Evidence was also brought forth under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which states in part,
State parties undertake to prohibit and to eliminate racial discrimination in all its forms and to guarantee the right of everyone without distinction as to race, color, or national or ethnic origin to equality before the law, notable the enjoyment of the following rights: the right to equal treatment before the tribunals and all other organs administering justice, the right to security of person and protection by the state against violence or bodily harm, whether inflicted by government officials or by an individual, group, or institution.
testifying on conditions for black people in southern prisons was Richard Mafundi Lake.
They wouldn't allow me any reading material for 12 years. They took and put me in a cell, 5-by-8 cell, without benefit of any writing material, reading material, radio, TV, non-cellmate for 12 years. Only thing was in that strip cell was a face basin where you only cold water, running cold water. There was no bed. It was a concrete slab block. And the only time I came out of that cell was to go to a shower for 5 minutes. And if you wasn't through showering in 5 minutes, the water was cut off on you. You didn't have any control of the water. That was for 12 years. And the only way I maintained my sanity was to play mental games with myself. I learned how to play chess without a board. I wouldn't allow them to destroy me. I was placed, I think it was 21 days that I was forced to go without bread or water. I was in a cell, stripped, winter time, sub-zero degree weather, and there was no heating, no ventilation. I was forced to lie on that concrete block, and then the guards would come by for additional punishment and throw water on the floor. It would get so cold that the only way I could sleep, I would just run in my cell until I was just completely exhausted, and I would just fall out from exhaustion and sleep. You see the little blocks in the toilet tissue? They used to give us 3 blocks, actually count the blocks of toilet tissue. And I used to take the 3 blocks of toilet tissue and lie on that cold floor and put it on my chest and psych myself that I was covering myself with a blanket. You know, under severe conditions, a person play all kind of mental games with himself in order to survive.
Further evidence on the government's violation of this international convention was put forth by Akil al-Jundi, who was a participant in the Attica Rebellion in New York.
On September the 9th, 1971, at Attica State Prison, there had been a unanimous decision by over 1,200 prisoners at Attica. And that position was that because of all the racism that had existed at Attica and the prison system within New York State and in the entire country, that it was a need for something to happen. On September the 9th, 1971, we took to the yard 1,281 strong. On September the 13th, 1971, 43 people lost their lives as an outcome of the rebellion. Now, we know that rebellions go on at different times, and what they do is they escalate our particular level of struggle. In this particular case, raised the question of prisons, prisoners, and the relationship of prisons to black folk, particularly in the wilderness of North America. There is a suit right now that is pending, and this civil suit is demanding $2.8 billion from the Rockefeller estate, because we remember that the governor at the time of the rebellion was none other than Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. And we want to give to the international body our suit so that the world will not forget
what happened at Attica.
And Afeni Shakur, a member of the Grand Jury Project and former defendant in the New York Panther 21 trial in 1969, brought forth extensive evidence concerning COINTELPRO attacks against the Black liberation struggle.
My nephew was beginning first grade in 1968, and that was the year of the infamous UFT teacher strike in this city. And here, thousands of children were left without schools, and so people across this city got together and set up alternative programs. The Black Panther Party was very much involved in that struggle, and I joined that struggle in 1968. By April of 1969, I was in jail, charged with some 350 felonies, including conspiracy to do just about everything there is to conspire to do. We were all acquitted. The state of New York wasted $1.5 million in trying to send us all to jail, but their conspiracy did not end there, and some of them are now political prisoners. It's important for us, however, to begin by understanding what a counterintelligence program really is. A counterintelligence program is a military operation. One goal of any counterintelligence program is to neutralize a hostile agent. The United States government considers all elements of the Black liberation movement hostile agents. When the counterintelligence program was aimed at the Black liberation movement, there was only one heading in which all Black people fell, and that heading is called Black Hate Extremist Groups. And under that heading fell the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, the Black Panther Party, of course, Malcolm X, and anybody that fell any place within those parameters. And that, I believe, covers the general trend existing in any Black family and in any Black community.
Look all around us, people are starving and dying. Time for living, if you're willing, it's freedom time. Yeah.
The United Nations has also adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which declares in part that
everyone has the right to a nationality. Everyone has the right to education. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms.
Professor Del Hunter was demoted from position as Dean of Medgar Evers College in New York for supporting the struggle of African students for control of the institution in the interest of the Black community.
The way that the Black intellectual became utilized was literally not to transmit knowledge, not to discover new information, not to engage in human understanding, but literally to reproduce in a very mechanical and a very formal way that information that had been received from the ruling forces. The responsibility, therefore, of anyone who strikes of talking about freedom, liberation, and a revolution is that of creating an antithesis of the present understanding of reality. The idea, therefore, is for the core of people who have been housed outside of the institutions of higher learning, who, by the way, have usually made more of a major contribution toward the development of Black people than those who've been housed inside, okay? The idea is to establish a link and a mechanism so that these individuals have a forum in order to exist and to carry on the information sharing and the understanding that they have.
This Universal Declaration of Human Rights also holds that
everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control.
One of the many individual Black people who came forward to give testimony on her conditions of life and right to reparations was Sharon Smith.
One of the unique things about Central Brooklyn is that it's the largest Black population in the country, but the majority of that population is made up of women and children. One of the most pressing problems for us as mothers in this city is decent housing. We have a responsibility of providing a decent home for our children. However, it is kind of hard to do that when you're being exploited and oppressed by a criminal landlord, further perpetuated by a court system. I've lived in apartments where, well, the ceilings are always falling in. That's common. Rodents, rats, roaches is a common problem. The cold is a common problem in a lot of buildings that I've lived in this city. When the temperature was below 0 last year, we froze. You have on twice as many clothes inside, and you take off clothes to go outside. I was getting a lot of phone calls and letters home from the teachers as such, and he can't be still, my son can't be still, my son is not being productive. And I did not know how to get across to these teachers that if my son go to bed cold and then he wake up cold and he can't wash up efficiently in the bathroom that the ceiling is falling in, how in the world is he going to be productive in a classroom in a public school of miseducation, which is another story in itself? We go to housing court, and on any day of the week, there are loads of people, African people, to be dealing in that system at one time. Something is definitely wrong. I consider that genocide. They're trying to kill our spirits. What it has done is just rise my anger. I want to see justice. I want to see reparations for us.
Testimony was brought out concerning the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which includes the following provisions.
The state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The steps to be taken to achieve the full realization of this right shall include those necessary for the provision of the reduction of the stillbirth rate and of infant mortality and for the healthy development of the child, the creation of conditions which would assure to all medical service and medical attention in the event of sickness.
Black healthcare activist Ibun Adelona testified to the systematic violation of this provision by the United States and state authorities in regards to black people in the U.S.
In regards to our struggle for self-determination, we have had to define for ourselves what that means. For us, that means having control over the institutions that affect our lives. It means the ability to define our needs and to have access to resources to develop the social forms that would meet those needs. Generally, throughout the world, infant mortality rates are recognized as one of the most reliable measures of the general health status of a community. Among African people in New York, our rate of infant death is 36.8% greater than that of white New Yorkers. If you compare Manhattan and Brooklyn to Mississippi, you see an even larger discrepancy in the sense that 2 to 3 times those numbers begin to appear in other parts of the country. We found that there was a pattern of hospitals being closed in black communities. Now, when you have an understanding of the relationship of business and government in regards to whether or not a hospital stays open, then you understand that when a hospital closes, it is because the government wants that hospital to close. What they do is pull back on the kind of reimbursement that they give to that hospital, so in effect they create a bankruptcy. A total of $10.7 billion was spent in New York City in 1980 for healthcare expenditures, and $5.7 billion of this was spent on hospital care. Over 50% of that money for New York City, and I'm talking about all 5 boroughs, went to that string of hospitals in the area that we call Bedpan Alley, which is a predominantly white, middle class and upper class community. And we're talking about tax dollars. We're talking about the money that comes from all of us. We're talking about our money is going disproportionately to one sector in regards to the health industry.
Following the testimony, the judges retired and determined a unanimous verdict. Speaking on the impact of the tribunal was Justice Ladipu Solanke, chairman of the National United Movement of Barbados.
A people who have faced the horrors as outlined in the testimony of these 2 days must congratulate themselves to have the moral fortitude to be here for this historical tribunal. Irrefutable evidence has been brought before this tribunal to indict the U.S. government without a shadow of a doubt. African people in the U.S. are indeed due reparations from the United States government. The crime against African people in the U.S. is without fear of contradiction the greatest crime in the known history of human civilization.
The verdict of the judges was that
1. African people in the U.S. are due reparations from the U.S. government at the amount of $4.1 trillion, with damages to be determined at later tribunals. 2. Imprisoned black revolutionaries should be granted political prisoner and prisoner of war status based on the Geneva Convention and other United Nations determinations. 3. U.S. treatment of Africans in the U.S. represents a serious enough breach of the United Nations Human Rights Charter to justify eviction of the U.S. from the United Nations. And 4. The testimony and documentation presented at the tribunal justifies the establishment of a permanent body to monitor U.S. treatment of African people in the U.S.
Calling for the black communities around the United States to take out the verdict of the tribunal and organize chapters of the African National Reparations Organization, Omali Yeshitela, People's Advocate and Chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, summed up the Reparations Tribunal.
We've heard testimony, and there has been introduced documentation which shows that it is the oppression of African people here and throughout the world which is the very foundation, the cornerstone of the existence of this terrible world economic system that causes destruction throughout this earth. Such being the case, it's very clear that if you remove the cornerstone, the building will come tumbling down. Our oppression represents the cornerstone and at the same time the weakest link in this imperialist country, this imperialist world. And therefore, the judgment which comes from a tribunal such as this is very, very important. If you live in a country or a world that is built on slavery, barbarity, thievery, genocide, the institutions of that society in any place of the world will be there for the purpose of sustaining the enslavement and the genocide. We have set about creating another institution, and this institution is a world tribunal which brought the United States government for the first time in its history to trial for the crimes that it has committed against black people in this country. And this tribunal is biased tribunal. It is a tribunal that moves off the assumption that black people must be free. It moves clearly off the assumption that black people must be free, and that anything that stands in the way of that liberation must be removed.
America was built, understand, by stolen labor on stolen land. Take a second thought as you clap and stamp. Can you rock the house from inside the camp? As you move into the beat to the early light, the country's moving to the right. Prepare now, all get high and wait, cause it ain't no party in the police state.
This program was produced by Burning Spear Media, narrated by Dorothy Lewis and Laura Dotson. Senior producer was Gaeta Cambone. Audio engineer was Sandy Thompson. For more information and programs, visit theburningspear.com.
How we gonna make the black nation rise? Gotta agitate, educate, and organize. How we gonna make the black nation rise?
Uhuru Comrades. That was a brief documentary that we did on the World Tribunal that happened in 1982 in New York, November 1982. And I think just from listening to that, and these were excerpts from some of them, there were many more testimonies that were presented, and even the ones that we heard actually were much more extensive than what we've been able to put forward. But clearly, it is profound, and this notion that somehow we have to go someplace and have the U.S. Congress provide or permit a study to determine whether reparations are due comes from a different worldview than what we of the African People's Socialist Party have. We, the African working class, did put the United States government on trial. The African People's Socialist Party, advanced detachment of the African Revolution, brought forth witnesses, testimony, documentation, the first quantification of the amount of value stolen from African people in the history of this country, the first time such value was ever quantified. And of course, the $4.1 trillion that we mentioned in 1982 for labor alone is simply a snippet of the real value when you consider that the trade in African people and the labor of African people created the entire social system itself of capitalism. Then you see that there is no value in this system that is not owed to African people and to the indigenous peoples in this country from whom this land was stolen. I'm on page 50 of the Reparations Now. And I'm beginning to read at the second to the last paragraph, beginning, brothers and sisters, and this is from the testimony, presentations at the World Tribunal. Brothers and sisters, Africans and peoples of the world. I have only read excerpts from the various principles and documents which will provide the basis in international law for the legality of the World Tribunal, because that was critically important for us too, because the fact of the matter is that up until this point, there was no legal basis for somebody who did not have state power to bring a case to the United Nations against some entity that does have state power. So part of what we were doing is challenging this whole notion, first of all, in the African community, the African world, of the sanctity of U.S. law. If we remember, it was U.S. law that sanctified slavery and every other thing that's ever happened to us. The various forms of Jim Crow and other colonial manifestations were sanctioned by U.S. law. So we had to say that in principle there's a law that's greater than United States law, one that people who required law as a justification for struggle would be able, hopefully, to appreciate. And we say there's an international law. And so we went through international law to establish the basis for the tribunal itself, and then use international law to establish the basis of having a law that supersedes, that's the law of the United States, that should be recognized, and African people ourselves could use as a political justification for waging the struggle for reparations and against genocide. So I have only read excerpts from the various principles and documents which will provide the basis in international law for the legality of this World Tribunal. The fact that excerpts were read which highlight various aspects of these principles and documents should not be interpreted as meaning the full body of these principles and documents should not be considered. Rather, I have been merely exercising my responsibility as people's advocate to provide a minimum of leadership for this World Tribunal. The honorable panel of international juries have been provided with the full text of the principles and documents from which the previously read excerpts were extracted. However, it is also the responsibility of this World Tribunal to facilitate the understanding of those attending these proceedings. Therefore, this people's advocate was obligated to put forth this elaboration of principles and documents so as to make it possible for this entire assembly to make a judgment as to the legality of this World Tribunal on reparations for black people in the United States. Sisters and brothers, Africans and peoples of the world, the black population of the United States of North America constitutes an oppressed domestic colony subjected to the most brutal conditions of existence. A colony is a group of people that's dominated by some external hostile alien force that controls the economy, the politics, and everything about that people. That's what a colony is. That's the understanding and approach that we took to this World Tribunal and to the question around reparations. We are colonized people. And so not a part of the United States, but a victim of the United States. Not citizens of the United States, but subjects of the United States as the colonial power. Wherever there are African people in this country, there is political and social oppression and the most severe forms of economic exploitation. Wherever there are African people within this country, there is forced sterilization of our women. Wherever we are, there are disproportionately high death rates for our babies. Wherever there are African people in this country, there is criminal imprisonment of our men. There is police terror, dilapidated housing, and unsanitary living conditions, and rates of unemployment which are genocidal. Sisters and brothers, Africans and peoples of the world, according to reports from the National Urban League, more than 50% of all the Africans in the U.S. South live below the government's officially established poverty line. The average physician ratio in this country is 1 to 700. For black people within the so-called inner city areas, the ratio is 1 to every 3,000. Of some 350,000 medical doctors in this country, only 1.7%, or 6,048 are Africans. Of 15,000 dentists, only 3,000 are black. Of 800,000 registered nurses, only 60,000 are black. In this report to the state of Black America, 1981, the National Urban League revealed that 47 out of every 100 black babies are born into poverty compared to fewer than 1 in 8 white babies. The report continues by stating that, and I quote, "From birth throughout young adulthood, blacks still face staggering obstacles as they struggle to achieve decency, dignity, and success in America. Twice as many black as white women lack prenatal care at almost every stage of pregnancy. This imbalance persists despite high correlations between lack of prenatal care and infant mortality and illness. Black mothers die in childbirth 3 times as often as white mothers. Of those who survive, 1 in 40 must then watch her baby die in the first year of life. Growing up, black children are more likely to be sick because they are more likely to be poor. 1 out of 7 black children under the age of 15 lacks a regular source of health care. Partly as a result, black children aged 1 to 4 die of heart disease 100% more often than white children, and die from accidents 50% more often than white children. New tuberculosis cases occur 5 times as often among black as among white children. Less than half of all black children live born with both parents. The majority live with single-parent families or with other relatives. Black children are more likely than white children to live without or away from any family and are disproportionately represented in institutions that typically serve the young. For example, children's homes, psychiatric facilities, where twice as many non-whites as blacks have no families at all. The black child's mother goes to work when her child is younger, works longer hours, and earns less than a white child's mother. Once a black child enters public school, he or she is twice as likely as a white child to be held back a grade, 3 times as likely to be placed in classes for the educable mentally retarded, and twice as likely to be suspended from school. It should be no surprise, therefore, that in any year, for every 2 black students who graduate from high school, 1 drops out, unquote. Sisters and brothers, Africans and peoples of the world, I have put forth this long quote in order to provide a glimpse of what life is like for African people here within the United States of North America. These are irrefutable facts and represent only a glimpse of the reality of poverty and oppression we are confronted with. They do not deal with the rate of police murder or the growing white mob violence we are confronted with, the task we have before us, that of revealing 400 years of bloody terror and oppression mandated and or allowed by the United States government, is Herculean enough as it is. Therefore, I will not be able to expose every detail of this 400 years. However, much of this information will be put before the World Tribunal by others who will testify from New York City and from throughout the U.S. There's one thing we must reveal, however, and that is, notwithstanding the obviously reactionary character of the present U.S. administration and the tendency of each generation of our people to be born into social circumstances which give the impression of being particular to it, the oppression of African people as revealed in the previously stated data is not new. It did not begin recently. Rather, it is historic. And anyone who wishes to understand the nature of our oppression and the motive force of our struggle needs to understand that our oppression is historical. The struggle is one we have been making since we have been in this country. Indeed, our struggle began before we arrived in this country. It began on the very first day that a European businessman put his foot on the continent of Africa and forced an African to do something against her or his will. We have heard the testimony from a noted black historian which served to dispel the notion, quite prevalent within the United States and Europe, that the enslavement of African people served to rescue us from a state of savagery. You have heard the testimony revealing that African civilization was a great civilization which made fundamental contributions to the development of human civilization. This testimony clearly revealed that as a people we were better off while free in Africa than we have been since the loss of our freedom due to the European invasion of Africa and our subsequent enslavement in the United States. This testimony should prove without a shadow of a doubt that there is a direct relationship between our loss of self-determination, our loss of a capacity for self-serving production, and our current conditions of existence, which is characterized by foreign and alien domination, by poverty and state-sanctioned terror, by white mobs and paramilitary organizations which hold highly publicized armed training sessions throughout the U.S. Sisters and brothers, Africans and peoples of the world, the truth of the matter is that the oppression of African people in the United States is part and parcel of that oppression which began more than 500 years ago for all African people in this world. It is a part of that oppression in history, which robbed the African continent of the power of self-rule and self-serving production. The history of the oppression of African people in the U.S. is part and parcel of the history of the oppression of African people worldwide, that part of history which saw millions of our people enslaved, dragged from Africa like cattle and deposited on the shores of foreign lands throughout the world. The history of the oppression of African people in the U.S. cannot be understood without understanding its historical connection to the history of oppression of our people throughout the world. For it was this history which gave birth to the present oppressive world economic and political system, which defines the context of our oppression and our struggle. If we are to charge the United States government with crimes against our people, which have become traditional over nearly 400 years, we must begin with the origin of the problem. And there's no way we can possibly do this without showing the connection between the attack on Africa, the initiation of the slave trade, and their fundamental decisive role in the development of the capitalist system and the loss of freedom for black people throughout the world. The looting and pillage of Africa by Europe gave birth to the world capitalist system, and the trade in African flesh gave birth to the world economy, which even now defines the conditions of existence for most peoples of the world. Karl Marx, historian, economist, and philosopher of the 19th century, made these telling remarks concerning the development of European and U.S. capitalism. Quote, "The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief momentum of primitive accumulation, the necessary condition for capitalist production. And then Marx says, direct slavery is just as much the pivot of bourgeois industry as machinery, credits, etc. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that has given the colonies their value. It is the colonies that have created world trade. And it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greatest importance. Economic category. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe out North America from the map of the world, and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations, unquote. Finally, we have Marx making this statement. While the cotton industry introduced child slavery in England, it gave in the United States a stimulus to the transformation of the earlier more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage earners in Europe needed for its pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. In other words, even the the white working class rested upon a pedestal of the enslavement of African people. Unquote. Sisters and brothers, Africans and peoples of the world, these proceedings on today and tomorrow constitute the World Tribunal on Reparations for black people in the United States. Such being the case, it is absolutely essential that we reveal the basis of our claim for reparations. Consequently, I must say a bit more about the origin of our claim. Such origin being tied to the European invasion of Africa and the world trade in African bodies. It was this invasion and trade which got us here in the U.S. and began the struggle we are involved in now in Miami, Florida, Brooklyn, New York, Norfolk, Virginia, Oakland, California, Birmingham, Alabama, and throughout the U.S. It was this invasion and trade which are the source of U.S. and European wealth and the poverty and oppression of African people throughout the world. The remarks I make concerning this matter will be rather brief and perfunctory. However, a more detailed historical and economic analysis has been made available to the Honorable International Panel of Judges as well as the official observers. This document will also be useful to the judges and observers during the entire historical and economic presentation which will occur on tomorrow. And that economic presentation will be broken down into three periods. One, the period of chattel slavery from 1619 to 1865. The period of the rise of U.S. colonialism from 1865 to 1945. 3, the period of the adaptation of neocolonial forms to the domestic African colony from 1945 to 1982, which was the tribunal year, unquote. I mean, in the meantime, I would like to submit this lengthy quote from one of Africa's greatest historians and sellouts, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. It should deepen our understanding of the role the slave trade played in the development of the present world economy, which enriches the few and exploits and oppresses the vast majority. Quote, this is Du Bois. The rebirth of civilization in Europe began in the 15th century. At this time, African and Asiatic civilizations far outstripped that of Europe. In the Black Sudan nations, civilization had risen and fallen even earlier. Mali, which flourished in the 13th and 14th centuries, fell before the empire of Songhai, which in the 15th century became a vast organized government 2/3 the size of the United States, with trade and commerce and cultural connections through its university in Sankor, with Spain and Italy and Eastern Roman Empire. It was here that the rape of Africa began and transformed the world. There can be little doubt but that in the 14th century, the level of culture in black Africa south of the Sudan was equal to that of Europe and so recognized. What changed all this? What killed the Sudanese empire, brought anarchy into the valley of the Nile, decimated the thick populations in East and Central Africa and pressed the culture of West Africa beneath the ruthless heel of the rising European culture. In 1690, the upheaval of civil war in England was at an end, and England was ready to embark on the slave trade for the benefit of her sugar and tobacco colonies. The British increased the import of slaves to America, raised sugar, indigo, and cotton, and began to bring these goods to England for processing. Then they exported some of these goods to Africa to buy more slaves. Trade began to change from a gambler's search for treasure to investment for permanent income. And this income consisted of goods for sale, which were in practice found more valuable than treasures for hoarding. To perfect this arrangement, slaves and more slaves must be had. While the British were fighting ostensibly for dynastic disputes in Europe, they were really in the War of Spanish Succession and the 7 Years' War, fighting for profit through world trade and especially the slave trade. In 1713, they gained by the coveted Treaty of Asiento the right to monopolize the slave trade from Africa to the Spanish colonies. In that century, they beat Holland to her knees and started their economic decline. They overthrew the Portuguese in India, and finally, by the middle of the century, overcame the last rival in India, the French. In the 18th century, they raised the slave trade to the greatest single body of trade on earth. The Royal African Company transported an average of 5,000 slaves a year between 1680 and 1686. But the newly rich middle-class merchants were clamoring for free trade in human flesh. Eventually, the Royal African Company was powerless against the competition of the free merchant traders, and a new organization was established in 1750 called the Company of Merchants Trading to Africa. In the first 9 years of this free trade, Bristol alone shipped 160,950 Negroes to the sugar plantation. In 1780, 146 ships sailed from British ports to Africa with the capacity of 36,000 slaves. In 1771, there were 150 ships and 47,000 slaves. The British colonies between 1680 and 1786 imported over 2 million slaves. By the middle of the 18th century, Bristol owned 237 slave vessels, London 147, and Liverpool 89. The slave trade brought Liverpool in the late 18th century a clear profit of £300,000 a year. The proportion of slave trips to the total shipping of England was 1 in 100 in 1709 and 1/3 in 1771. By 1750, there was hardly a manufacturing town in England which was not connected with the colonial trade. The profits provided one of the main streams of that capital which financed the Industrial Revolution. The British Empire was regarded as a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation. William Wood said that the slave trade was the spring and parent whence the others flow. Postlethwaite described the slave trade as the first principle and foundation of all the rest, the mainspring of the machine which set every wheel in motion. Sir Dalby Thomas declared that every person employed on the sugar plantation was 130 times more valuable to England than one at home. That's every African that was, quote unquote, employed on the sugar plantation was 130 times more valuable to England than one at home. Professor Pittman has estimated that in 1775, British West Indies plantations brought in 4 million pounds as compared with 1 million from the rest of the world. Sisters and brothers, Africans and peoples of the world, most historians of the United States and the world will concede that the enslavement of African people was of major significance to the development of capitalism in Europe and the U.S. However, most historians in Western Europe and the United States would argue that what happened in Africa and with the slave trade is past history, that it has no significance for the economic situation of today. They would argue that the many years since then have somehow diminished or liquidated the significance of the economic impact of the of the invasion of Africa and the slave trade on today's world, we will prove just the opposite. We will prove that the unifying thread which runs through the annals of history subsequent to the attack on Africa and the enslavement of our people is the continuing oppression of African people throughout the world. This World Tribunal on Reparations for Black people in the United States will prove not only that the current state of our existence stems from the slave trade which gave birth to capitalism in Europe and the United States, but we will also prove that the rate of economic exploitation from our labor and our presence in this country is greater in 1982 than it was in 1619, and for this exploitation we demand reparations. But first, let me briefly sum up what has already been put before this World Tribunal. And then we'll move with the testimony that's going to contribute to our ability to make a determination, a judgment, based on the law that has been quoted before. The struggle of African people within the U.S. is as old as the United States of North America itself. Indeed, it is older than the United States of North America, as it is a struggle which really began with the attack on Africa by Europeans who initiated the sale of black bodies into slavery throughout the world. The slavery which played a critical role in the economic and political development of the United States of America. The history of our relationship with the U.S. is documented in blood, gore, and humiliation. The number of us who perished in the passage from Africa to the Americas during the slave trade are in the millions. Various historians estimate that from 50 to 200 million African people were kidnapped from Africa and forcibly dispersed throughout the world. The history of African people in the U.S. is a history which has seen us forcibly removed from Africa, our mother country, and subjected to a brutal existence in the U.S. as slaves and colonial subjects in a land stolen from its indigenous population, which has barely survived attacks upon it which continue up to this very day. The history of African people within current U.S. borders is also a history of struggle and resistance against brutal conditions of existence imposed upon us by an alien and foreign power whose only interest in our people has been our capacity to provide wealth and profits for our oppressors. In the first place, this struggle and resistance was directed at the invaders and kidnappers on the African continent itself, where historic battles were fought to prevent the theft of Africa's most precious resources, her sons and daughters, as well as the land and its abundant wealth. Secondly, the struggle and resistance of African people has been directed at the attempt to smash and fragmentize our national identity, both in Africa and the U.S., as well as in other lands to which we were forcibly dispersed, enslaved, and colonized. Thirdly, the struggle and resistance of African people within the United States and throughout the world has been directed at overturning our oppression and exploitation. This oppression and exploitation has its origin in the initial attack on Africa, which led to our conditions of existence within the U.S. and to the colonialism, neo-colonialism, underdevelopment, and imperialist hegemony in Africa. Uhuru. Yeah. So, Uhuru.
Applause for Chairman Omali Yeshitela and that brilliant study. It was very powerful, and we want to acknowledge all of our viewers on YouTube and on Facebook who are tuning into this wonderful, brilliant history. And we have viewers from Washington, D.C., Indianapolis, Indiana, St. Louis, Missouri, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Michigan, Huntsville, Alabama, Greensboro, North Carolina, Springfield, Illinois, Miami, Florida, Clearwater, Florida, Houston, Texas, Rotterdam, Netherlands, Portland, Oregon, Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, and London, UK. So, Uhuru to everyone watching, and we have comments. I'm going to them. Okay. So we have Malika Alexander says, salute Chairman Omali Yeshitela. As we watch the question of reparations take center stage as members of the Vanguard, we look on with pride and wonder why they're acting like some strange thing is happening in the world. We're glad y'all are no longer asleep on this issue. However, you should recognize this ain't new. Our extraordinary leader with foresight and insight developed the theory of African internationalism and cried loud and spared not. The APSP had this on lock already. You tardy. Hashtag Omali taught me. Uhuru Malika. And we have comments from Carmen Nanayal Grant, who's the Northern Regional Rep for the African People's Socialist Party, says, Nanayal is watching this amazing historical presentation and study of reparations and the African People's Socialist Party's history and role in forwarding this righteous struggle for the people. We have Comrade Tachara Masimba in St. Louis, Missouri. This is an extraordinarily democratic process where the people get to testify about the crime that has been committed against them. We must put the United States on trial. The people, under the leadership of its own revolutionary party, must do it. We must push the whole question of reparations to its final conclusion, that the whole system must go and the people must be free. Uhuru. Crown Dion in St. Petersburg, Florida says he's sitting at Quickies with the people and we're listening to Omali Yeshitela. And Quickies is a little corner store here in the African community. And we have Dave, the question from Dave Ima. The era of empire has passed. What do we do to change the present situation of Africa? What do we do to revisit the independent agreements of all African countries from their colonial masters? The French and the British colonies went into slave contracts with their colonial masters. How can these agreements of colonial continuation continue in Africa? That was the question.
Uhuru, I just want to say that I think one of the things that's not well understood by African people is this question of class and class exploitation. That is to say, what Europe did with its invasion of Europe and the advent of the creation of the whole capitalist system, it also created a sector of the African population that was dependent on this relationship with Europe. They became a petty bourgeois class, a ruling class, and a bourgeoisie in waiting, a bourgeoisie in the process of developing. And then what occurred in 1963 with the creation of the Organization of African Unity, which was something that was done to circumvent efforts being made by Kwame Nkrumah, who was first president of independent Ghana, to unite all of Africa as one single state under one authority with one economy, one foreign policy, one military, etc. What happened is that in 1963, the Europeans influenced the emergence of the Organization of African Unity. And the Organization of African Unity is something that actually codified the colonial borders, so that instead of the one state that Nkrumah was fighting for, now what this entity did, despite all the struggles that Nkrumah made, and people should read Kwame Nkrumah's presentation on May 24th, 1963, to the Organization of African Unity, where he warned them that if they did not unite and have a single Africa, what would happen? And of course, everything he predicted did happen and is happening even today. So the Organization of African Unity, what it did was it consolidated a whole neo-colonial force on the continent of Africa under the leadership of imperialist white power, with different imperialist powers controlling. For example, the French, even up to today, control something like 14 different territories that they call countries in Africa, that have formerly their own flag and formerly, I think most times their own currency and things like that, but all of them are tied to French imperialism and can't make a move without France, can't even trade with each other, can't even trade with anybody else without France giving them permission to do that. And that's some kind of relationship like this exists throughout all of Africa, where the former colonial powers still control. That's what neo-colonialism is. When the colonial powers can remove themselves from public view, but still controls the economies of the different countries. And it is they who make the decisions about who's going to head these states. They are the ones who protect these artificial entities. And then the African petty bourgeoisie, who become leaders here, these states function as a kind of incubator for the reproduction of that social class. And so they began to protect that state They don't want to see a united Africa, because if there's a united Africa, which means that there might be one president or one prime minister or one leader of the Africa, and then what happens to the other 53? And so all of them want to protect their own turf. This is what they created. And so what has to happen in Africa, what we are promoting, what we're trying to organize, is revolution from the bottom up. That these entities that they call countries and states in Africa are going to have to be overthrown by African internationalists who, in the process of doing that, establish beachheads on the continent of Africa for the unification of all of Africa. That's the only way we're going to move forward. None of these neo-colonial forces, that's why they killed Thomas Sankara, that's why they killed Lumumba, that's why they did with Nkrumah, and even others who were not revolutionaries who questioned this setup, like Gbagbo from Ivory Coast, who was attacked. The French came in, bombed, overthrew his government, and put somebody in power that they wanted to have in power. That's a common phenomenon that you see throughout the continent of Africa. And Africa has no future except an African internationalist future. And we have to have a single revolutionary party that organizes all of the workers and peasants, poor peasants on the continent of Africa to advance the interests of African people. And that's the work that we do on a daily basis. Uhuru.
Thank you, Chairman. And we had a comment from Olufin Ikemba from St. Pete. It says, the rich history of the African People's Socialist Party. Everyone must know that the APSP transformed the question of reparations and made it a household topic. We have a salute from Comrade Walia, New Jersey. Uhuru, this is a powerful study. Educate, agitate, and organize. Adam Eterno in the Netherlands is viewing on Facebook and commented, thanks to this lecture, I became aware of other arguments / replies to the fallacy Africans sold their own people into slavery and thus no grounds for reparations. And then goes on to comment, Japan and Japanese were enemies of, fought against USA and took part to World War II on the other side. Nonetheless, were reparations to Japanese incarcerated in U.S. concentration camps in war times. A number of Jews took the side of Nazi Germany, and many were guards, torturers, and executioners in concentration camps. Nonetheless, reparations were paid to Jews following World War II. Secretary General Louisa Kinshasa of the African Socialist International in London comments, Uhuru, Chairman, brilliant and powerful true history of reparations. Ikemba in Philly asks, should Africans charging genocide and the fight for reparations be separate struggles, or should these campaigns be conflated?
It's the same struggle. That's why this tribunal, if you look at the document of this tribunal, there were 4 questions I think were raised for the jurors. One was reparations due to African people. What was the question that he just raised? And we used the law, the Convention on Genocide, as part of the basis for even the discussion about reparations. So it's a part of the same struggle, and that's something that should really be understood, that genocide is a colonial thing. It is, and that's why many of the black liberals, who sometimes call themselves communists and leftists and things like that, can't deal with the question, because they have to deal with colonialism. They would prefer to deal with the question of racism. So it's some kind of subjective struggle we're involved in about whether white people like us and whether we like white people and this kind of thing. Because if you deal with, when you deal with it that way, nobody can people are African or people are white, etc., and that's not a choice that people make. It's just you get born that way, and you get born into the circumstances under those, coming from that. But the thing is that anybody can unite against colonialism. So we're not asking anybody to unite against themselves. We're asking them to unite against colonialism. And colonialism is responsible for the condition that Africans and everybody else in the world experience today. It's responsible for the condition that white people experience today. And what white people are asked to do is not to not be white, be as white as hell as you want to be, but the thing is to be against colonialism, and which is the basis for this relationship that we find ourselves confronted with today. And that's why nobody's demanding of the people in Afghanistan to not be Afghans, to say be the people in Venezuela to not be Venezuelans, or the people in Iraq not to be Iraqis. They're not saying you got to integrate with America, something to that fact that make Americans like you. The point, even though that is a basic demand that's being made on the Venezuelans and the Iraqis and other people, make America like you. Because if America doesn't like you, then it'll bomb you or starve you to death, etc. And that's why many people, Africans, are afraid to challenge. I don't mean many Africans. People do that on the street corners every day, challenge white power. But many the petty bourgeois middle class intellectuals are afraid to challenge white power because they would prefer to find some way either to make white power like you or to make white power adhere to laws that it has created for the purpose of oppressing you in the first place. Uhuru.
Rafiq Kalonji in New York commented, I would like Chairman to expound on how the petty bourgeoisie are now raising the issue of reparations as a way to get black votes and make themselves more credible to masses, which might position them to issue an appeasement settlement rather than what reparations should do in functioning to advance the African independence movement.
But that's always been the position, more or less, of the petty bourgeoisie, even those who are wrapped in radical and sometimes anti-colonial clothing. As I mentioned earlier on, we had huge struggles with sectors of the so-called black liberation movement, not only around white people might get all the money, which is a common refrain from everyone who wants to attack a strategy that can win, or not only because they're Africans from Africa on the jurors, but they also had questions about what the reparations demand should be. Like some people saying you can get your teeth fixed. This is literally one of this guy who's called the father of the reparation movement. They put forth a position that you can use reparations to get your teeth fixed, get your house painted, get a new car and stuff like that. It was not about the national liberation of our people, despite how much they were supposed to be nationalists. And these are some of the same forces that supported Barack Hussein Obama bid for president. How in the hell can you be for self-determination? How can you be for the liberation of African people on the one hand, and then be for U.S. imperialism because the black person is in front of it on the other hand? That's impossible. But our party has always been clear. And so the African petty bourgeoisie hasn't moved one iota. And what they have confidence in is not the masses of African people taking power and taking our reparations. They have confidence in the ability somehow to cajole, win, they seduce the bourgeoisie into giving reparations. Some of them actually believe that that's the only way they can get what they call reparations. Some of them would actually be satisfied with a new poverty program as long as it's called reparations. And so, in fact, some of them think that's a great idea. Now we can get a new poverty program, but we just call it reparations. People are saying reparations, and the petty bourgeoisie will interpret that to mean what they want it to mean, and they will make a deal. And they're going to make a deal as soon as white power feels enough pressure and gets enough clarity to know that if they pay off these suckers, if they pay off some of them, then these groups will unite with them and say reparations has been achieved, and so the masses of African people still come out of here naked without having their teeth fixed or anything else for that matter. So that's the petty bourgeoisie looks out for its own interest, but the interests of the mass of African workers cannot be satisfied with that. You know, that's like what do they call it? What do they call this thing now? That universal health care? That's like what's the thing that's Medicare for all? That's effectively what they want to make that reparations. That ain't reparations. You can't give us reparations. We have to take it. Somebody here was going to raise something?
Oh, Uhuru, if you have something, can you come to the mic so everybody can see your face?
Uhuru, Chairman, I just first want to really salute this tribunal that you're reviewing and how powerful it is, and powerful for white people to know what we can do to join humanity. I wanted to know have you elaborate on why did you determine to have judges from Africa?
We wanted to have judges from Africa. There was supposed to be somebody there there were other judges from other countries who were supposed to be there as well, but they couldn't get into the country. The U.S. wouldn't allow them to come to the country. Part of this, of course, is for Africans to be there from the continent, because it's a universal contradiction, and because we are African internationalists, and part of what we do at the same time is to help Africans around the world understand this. For example, one person who testified at this tribunal was Lester Lewis, who was from London, England, and who headed an organization, I forgot, Hackney, in Hackney, part of London. And so part of it is helping all Africans to understand the universality of the contradiction that we're confronted with. And the other part of having international forces, again, was to contribute to the diplomatic and political encirclement of the United States, to isolate the United States in the whole world, to create an atmosphere in the world that can undermine the ability of the United States to politically to easily carry itself as it does even today as the defenders of human rights and this kind of stuff, when what was happening to African people was happening. And it was really critical also, we felt, for people on the continent to be able to take this message, because most of what Africans on the continent get an opportunity to see is Will Smith and Oprah Winfrey on TV or something to that effect, or Africans who leave here and go to Africa, and usually they are ambassadors. Even the most radical ones of them are ambassadors of U.S. Americanism, even if they don't say that, because they don't criticize what America is doing there. In other places, it's the same thing. So it was really important to bust that up, to bring a greater unity with Africans internationally, and to contribute to the political and diplomatic encirclement of the United States, which was Ronald Wilson Reagan was the newly elected president at that time, and he was the Donald Trump of that era for many people. He too was a performer. He actually called himself an actor. And they made what they used to call B-rated movies and things like that, and became a pitchman for some major corporation in this country. And now we got another performer who has attained the presidency of the United States. So there was some similarity. I wanted to raise this other question, though, that somebody referenced, this question of Japan and Jews getting reparations, because, again, it's really interesting because Ronald Wilson Reagan was no friend of the Japanese or Africans or anything else. But Japan had become a really powerful economic force in the world. I forgot what they used to characterize this emerging capitalist economy in Japan, this trade force. And so the U.S. was looking to advance its own relationship with Japan in terms of its economic interests with Japan. And so that was a sticking point for many Japanese people. And this was no way you can get around the fact the United States stuck these people, and these were not people these were U.S. citizens. Most of them people were U.S. citizens. They own land and what have you, and they put them in concentration camps and stole their land. The farmers in these particular areas stole their land. They had cultivated incredible, farms and agriculture things, and it was taken from them. So U.S. needed something in terms of a relationship with Japan economically to advance its own interests, and that's why Japan, it did it, and it gave it only a pittance anyway. I've forgotten what small amount of money that they gave to each of the so-called the survivors, the surviving people, the people who were still alive. And this is something that happened in the 1940s, and so the people who were still alive, they gave them some pittance that they call reparations, each individual. And then, two, the Jewish question. Because as quietly as it's kept, people don't know the history. Like the U.S., this great proponent of Israel and Jewish people and anti-Semitism and all this garbage, they don't know the history, how the United States wouldn't even allow Jews who were trying to get out of Germany to come into this country. I mean, and the immigration policies that targeted Jews and what have you, even as they were being murdered. That was the reality, but why was it important? Why did the U.S. then give them reparations? Not just the U.S., but other European countries. Because they needed that state of Israel as a bulwark of imperialism, as a military and political wing of U.S. power in the Middle East, as white people who would be dropped in the middle of Arabs and what have you, white people who had no historic interest in struggling against white power as it was coming from the U.S., and who would work for white power in their own interest. And when I say their interest, it's not in the interest of Jews, but some Jews are dumb enough and stupid enough to go in that direction, just like, people can do stupid things. Masses can without leadership. And but it was because they needed that entity there that they pumped all kind of resources, and reparations gave them the excuse to put all kinds of money into Israel. Not just the United States, but Germany and all these other countries were putting money there so that they could arm them, develop them, and make them a model white power entity that had become like a military outpost of U.S. imperialism. So be clear on that they were not doing Jews a favor as much as they were looking to protect their own interests, and the same thing is true with the Japanese, because they dropped 2 atomic weapons. You know, they dropped the only atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They killed, how many? Maybe 200,000 people, most of them civilians. You know, so it was not love of Japan that did that. It was looking out for their own economic interests that's responsible for that. And they ain't going to give us nothing like that either. And they have, I want to remind people again, that U.S. government is a liar. It has a policy of lying. It's not just that they tell some lies accidentally. I mean, they have a policy of lying. They'll tell you anything. They'll tell you anything. They have told you everything. And you just don't remember it because the leaders that you had at the moment, they were either killed if they tried to stand up for something, or they succumbed to the nonsense. But, you know, we were supposed to be free, you know, at the end of slavery. First of all, and we were supposed to have got reparations of a sort. I mean, who was it, Sherman? Who January 1st, 1865, turned over land all the way from Charleston, South Carolina, down to Jacksonville, Florida, 30 miles of coast, 30 miles from the coast. That land from Charleston, South Carolina, all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida. January 1st, 1865, Sherman, by order, turned that land over to African people. Many African people on the same day moved into those areas. That included the so-called Sea Islands and whatever, Geechee land, etc. And by the fall, the U.S. government retreated on everything and took it all back. That was, you know, and then Reconstruction. What about Reconstruction, where everybody's supposed to be free? And then by 1877, we were pushed back into conditions worse than slavery. That's the reality we are talking about. So why would you believe the United States government has never done anything for the indigenous people that stole all this land? And somebody said they gave the Indians reparations. How the hell can you give reparations to the people? You're still sitting on their land, and they are living in places right now where someplace there's no running water, and the lifespan is in the 40s. They haven't given a damn thing to the indigenous people. And so that's the reality. They will not give it to us. They're not going to give it. They will help to promote and uplift certain so-called leaders who can't make the ultimate demand on them and who do not represent the mass of the African community, the African nation, the African working class and poor peasantry. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Yeah.
Just one more round of applause for that amazing study. Chairman is on fire. And because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman sees your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, winning the war of ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress at burningspearmarketplace.com. Start preparing to attend the 10th Annual Conference of the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations on August 10th and 11th, themed Turn Imperialist Wars into Wars Against Imperialism, happening in St. Louis at the Uhuru House on West Florissant. For more info, visit blackisbackcoalition.org. The International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement invites you to attend our 2019 NPDEM convention. This year's convention is themed, The Struggle is Real, Real Science, Real Revolutionaries, Real Solutions, Real Black Power. Come join us September 13th through 15th at 4101 West Florissant Ave in St. Louis, Missouri, as we expose the ways that Africans are facing genocide at the hands of white power imperialism and how our only solution is building NPDEM, the leading organization in the struggle for bread, peace, black power, and reparations to African people. Register today at eventbrite.com. Were you moved by Chairman's presentation this morning? You can bring this electrifying presentation to your school campus, bookstore, concert hall, and more. To book Chairman Omali Yeshitela for the Vanguard 2019 International Speaking Tour, contact Uhuru Tours at info@omaliyeshitela.org or call 727-914-3621. Sign up for the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise taking place December 14th through the 19th. The Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise is the annual fundraiser held to support the work of the African Socialist International. The African Socialist International is an organization made up of African people located virtually on every continent, dedicated to overturning the conditions faced by African people worldwide. Due to the U.S. initiated travel ban to Cuba, our cruise destinations have changed to Half Moon Cay, Bahamas, Nassau, Bahamas, and Freeport, Bahamas. You can enjoy political education on board with the chairman, on and off board excursions, and more food than you can eat. To book/make your deposits, visit uhurulegacycruise.org or call the travel agent Linda Stern at 732-972-4171. If you want to further support the ASI and the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, make a donation by visiting uhurulegacycruise.org. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.